time, it seems. Can you just give me some feedback on if I'm speaking clearly enough, or like if everybody can hear me? Is that okay if I just speak that way? Okay, wonderful. Okay, first thing to notice is I'm going to I have only very few slides. It's not too many, like 10 or so. And so most of what I'm going to show is like an example and actual code for it. It's available in a build out. If you are really interested in, that's a URL where you can actually get it if you want to start it. I'm not sure if you have any good wireless in here at all. If you all try it at the same time, it's probably not going to work that great. You don't have to have the code, but if you want to, if I'm switching too fast to something, or you want to have a look at something, you can actually get it. And even if you don't run the whole build out, but just get the source code, it's quite tiny. That might be a good start. Okay. Everybody seems to be here. I have some water. Good. Good morning. I'm pleased to see so many people here that are actually interested in internationalization and localization in Plone. Hope you, well, after yesterday's party, you all made it early in the morning. That's wonderful. So good to see you. What are we going to talk about? Just a bit about me. The colors are awful, but it's a blue, that's a Norwegian blue up there, but that doesn't matter. It's not too colorful. So many of you might know me. My name is Hanos Schlichting. IRC name Hanos. I've been around for a while in the Plone community since 2001, being very active since 2005. For some reason, I ended up doing anything that is related to internationalization. I started with being the German translator, then realizing there's lots more to do in order to have a fully internationalized Plone, so I got into doing that a bit more. And for some reason, I ended up maintaining all the software we use to internationalize Plone itself, and took over some kind of informal leadership for the internationalization team, just getting new translators, organizing the translation efforts for Plone itself, and pulling people into the right direction. For 7 months now, I actually work with Plone for a living and make my money out of that living as a developer at i18n in Norway. Before that, I just worked in a local hospital in Hamburg in Germany who used Plone as their intranet solution, but I didn't actually have much time to work on Plone itself in my paid for time, but most of it was a hobby of mine. So, what are we going to talk about? Just a bit about what you always see those i18n, l18n, maybe g11n acronyms. What are we actually talking about here, and what do those actually mean? Then a bit about what is internationalization, what do we do here in order to internationalize a product. Then the part about how do we actually, once we did that, how do we actually translate a product or a package into another language, and what tools do we need? And if we still have time for that, I'm not quite sure. I haven't timed this completely, so it might be getting a bit off. Multilingual content, just the very basics on how to use Lingua Plone and how to get your own content type Lingua Plone aware. At the end, there's going to be lots of time for question and answers. Otherwise, if any time you have a question, just pull up your hand, and I hope I can answer it. It's supposed to be, you should be learning something from this. If I just have my talk and if you all sit here and listen, just see blank faces all the time, that's not the point of it. Okay, first, internationalization, just the Wikipedia definition of what it is. Internationalization is a process of designing a software application so it can be adapted to various languages and regions without engineering changes. What does it mean? The first very basic approach of how to internationalize a product is to copy the source code completely, change the source code, everything that is in anywhere local aware or needs to be translated, and just have a copy of the complete source code. That scales maybe for 2 languages, maybe for 3 with good merging tools for different subversion repositories or versioning control systems. Once you get to support more than 3 languages, it's probably not the process that's going to scale. So the focus of this is internationalization means you have a product that is in a where you are able to provide multiple translations for it without changing the source code of the product. The other part of what's in here is it's a process of designing software. That means it's not just like something you can put into your build pipeline and say this is kind of a compilation step and yeah, that now runs the internationalization step and you are done with it. It's a process you actually need in order, if you write your software, you actually need to be aware of what internationalization means and need to be aware of a couple of things to actually do that, and this is part of the development process. This is not something a machine can do afterwards for you. So once you did that, that's the second part, which is localization. It's a process, it's a process again, of adapting software for a specific region or language by adding local specific components and translating text. The most obvious one is translating text. If you have any kind of human visible user interface, what you want to do is to translate the text that the user has actually shown into their native language. There is another part about local specific components in here, which is about, there's sometimes stuff like date formatting. There's different rules for date formatting, how to show currencies, how to sort alphabetical listings. If you have just English as a language, it's very obvious. You have an ASCII, you just have an ASCII letter sign, and you have no, like, it's clearly defined. As soon as you have other languages, for example, in German, which is my mother language, you have just 3 additional characters, ü, which kind of are a, o, and u, but it's not obvious where you put them if you sort them alphabetically. Do you put them in line, or is this the 3 characters you put at the end? And actually, it depends on the kind of use case you have, how to do that. A telephone listing sorts them actually differently than just a name overview. So those kinds of things, usually you don't have those in Plone, or like, you don't have very good support for it, so usually you don't do that. But it's something to keep in mind. There is not just translating text, it's not all of the story. The most basic approach is you have a list of content types and want to have them, show them in some order. Currently what Plone default does is just show them in the alphabetical order of their names. If you change to a different language, what you want to do is to not have them ordered by their English names, by their IDs of some kind, but you want to show them at least ordered by their names in the target language, in the actual translated language. Otherwise you have just something which seems completely random for the end user, because what is this about? Oh, yeah, I have to translate this into English. Oh, the order is actually dependent on the English original word, which doesn't make any sense to him. So, what is another one? We are highly depending on something that is called getText. getText is part of the GNU translation project. It's been around for a very, very long time, and it's a package that is basically a set of tools, documentation, and standards. Whenever we have in the Plone environment anything that is called message catalogs, PO files, MO files, or the concept of a message, this is actually all dependent on the getText standard. The whole way we actually internationalize our products is based on this standard. So we haven't invented just our complete own way. Like Java has a different way of handling internationalization in packages and products, but we use this getText standard. We do have a couple of implementation details where Python itself needs to provide a mechanism to actually use those functionality that is defined, or like implement actually the standards that the getText standard defines. We do have those, part in Python itself, part on the SOAP level, a part of that is actually on the Plone level, where we have different kinds of implementations, how to actually get your message catalogs in any way loaded into the system, how to actually do that, how to actually have a translate function in any way in the environment to actually be able to translate something. Good. Any questions so far, like just as general? Yeah, please.
How does a tool like Babel fit in compared with this?
Okay, so the question was how does a tool like Babel fit into this? From what I know about Babel, it's basically as well based on the gettext standard. It's a tool that actually provides an implementation of gettext, for example, for Python itself. We currently don't use it, but we have something on the Python level itself. They will basically is a Python wrapper around C libraries which are provided by the GNU system, which is a bit hard for Clone because Clone always tries to be available on all platforms, including Microsoft Windows. So we are better off right now with having an approach that is purely Python-based and does not require any C libraries to be on the system. But it's something worth looking into if we have we do maintain our own software stack right now. It could be a good idea to look at it and see if we could make it work on Windows in a way that is easily installable for the end user and not have to maintain our own stack. There's a couple of, like gettext itself is not something that is just one standard that was defined 20 years ago, but gettext as a standard is actually changing over time, supporting through the process of how to work with those tools. There's actually recent support for a couple of new features which we don't have in our stack. There's something about message context and plural form support. As I will mention at one point, there's always going to be a couple of things which Clone currently doesn't do, which gettext as a standard might support, but we don't have in our level. The slide which I not put in, which should be next, is what is we do talk about text. Like most of what I'm going to talk about is going to be about text and how to translate text wherever it originates from. We have one concept, there's two concepts from the gettext standard, which one of them is called a domain, and the other one is just the basic concept of what is a message. In user interfaces, we usually have something like button labels, a descriptive text. It might be a whole paragraph of text. It might be a message showing up. You just deleted 3 objects. All of those are, for us, from the translation point of view, a message. The problem, there's a distinction between a message and just a word, because what translation of one language to another doesn't work on the basis of you just translate one word by another. If you do that, you can go to Google Translate or a couple of those tools and translate something into one language word by word. But what you get out of it is not something you can understand. And even if you would have a human doing that same thing, you would not get anything that transports the meaning of what you actually wanted to do. So what you need to keep in mind is whenever you want to translate something, what you want to translate is the actual meaning of what you put there. You expressed it in the original language with a word, for example, the word view. If you translate the word view without knowing anything about context, you can translate it into 15 different words in German. What is the appropriate one in that context is not just dependent on the word. So we do have 2 ways of expressing something. For a sentence, that's usually not a problem because a sentence is usually self-contained in some way and has an actual meaning. What you cannot do is, as well, just put half a sentence, translate it, and then put another half sentence and try to combine them in any way. There's not going to be anything which a translator can do to produce a meaningful outcome of it. So what you always need to keep in mind is you can't just, what the programmer can always do is here's a string, take the first 3 characters and just use it. Here's a string of a sentence and it starts with more information. Well, just take the first 4 characters and use it as a next button label because I wanted to have a short form of it. That's just not possible if you want to translate those strings. You cannot just, basically a message is some kind of semantically complete meaning. You can't divide it. You can't even attach 2 of those together and say, well, you just append them to another. You always have to keep in mind any of those tricks which you can do with strings, which we can combine them, slice them in any way, you cannot do with messages because you will not be able to translate them in any meaningful way. So 2 things we have is on one side something we call domains. Domains is something, domains of knowledge. Might be agriculture, might be oil industry or finance market. Domain just means, in our case, we have something like a subset of all the possible meanings. We have, what we do in the end is to transport those domains. We have a domain that is called clone. We have a domain that is called i18n types and one that is archetypes. What we do in software as a best practice is just to say one package, if you write your own package, you will define that as your own domain. So you have a subset of all the possible meanings, and based on that restriction, you can actually be a bit more loose about, okay, I know exactly what article is going to mean in my specific context. I know what item is supposed to mean. Otherwise, you have something like item doesn't have any direct translation into German. There is just no such word. Based on the context you use it in, if it's an item in a folder, if it's an item, if you go to the supermarket and put an item into your shopping box, it's going to be a completely different word. But if you have defined something as a domain to say, well, this is going to be the grocery store domain, well, you actually have a good more understanding of what it's going to be. The second part which we do is, even if you do have inside a domain, use the word still, like the clone domain, what the clone user interface is about is a very, very big, there's like 1,500 messages. And there's lots of button labels. There's lots of those very basic words like view, edit, delete, cancel that are kind of seem to always have a meaning depending on what context you use. If you delete a content rule, it might be that deleting a content rule is something that should be translated a bit differently with a different word in another language than deleting an item in a folder. So the second part which we do is we have a message, and often we do apply something like just an identifier to it, a message ID, which is just about, well, here's a unique identifier, so we can actually look up, see, this is the exact context in which we are going to use this string. So we don't have any ambiguity. So, next part is, what do we need to care about? That's basically the code point of view. Basically anything you have in a user interface that is human-facing. Human-facing means if you have something like an FTP or HTTP error code and a message attached to it, you as a party that is actually going to emit this error code is just going to provide it probably in English. Any kind of API error message you are probably going to provide in English. The browser that the actual human is going to use to see those error codes will then provide a translation of those error messages into the current language. But at the point where you're talking to a machine, you usually will not try to translate the meaning, but just keep it in English as a basic approach. If you have anything that is shown to the user, and it's your responsibility to show it to the user, you will have to translate it in some way and internationalize it. So what we have in, like, what are the typical parts we have? Page templates are kind of obvious. Whatever you have as a template is supposed to be used to render something which is actually going to be shown to the user. There's a couple of examples where that's not the case. We use, for example, a page template to render a RSS feed. None of the parts of actually the RSS feeds, the content itself is going to be in some way have to be translated, but the RSS feed semantic structure is actually not. So it's not something where you can say every page template has to be translated, but the majority of those. As another part, we have Python code. Python code is not so obvious, and there's no general rule where you can say all of Python code needs to be translated whenever I put something in. The most obvious one is, and whenever you talk about IDs of the content type ID, if you have that and want to look it up later on and somebody translated it for you, well, you can't use it anymore. So there's not everything, not every string you have defined in any part of your Python code is going to be need translating. You will have to actually look at it and see, is this something that is going to be shown to the user as an end result or not? So that's not, like, typical examples are archetype schemas where you have field names and label and widget names or widget descriptions. It's a typical example of, yes, this is actually going to be part of the user interface, and so you have to translate it. If you have any kind of internal data structures where you just push around data, you'll probably not have to translate them. The next part is generic setup. There is a couple of things in generic setup configuration we use right now which have to be translated. For example, workflow state names or transitions. This is going to show up for a user as an actual, okay, I should submit this item, this is in a published state. This is actually defined in generic setup as the only source. This is where we take the original value from. So we should mark this in some way to say, well, this is going to be needed to be translated. The other examples are action, just what shows up as an action name or what shows up as a type name. There's a couple of those where we actually need to translate them. Then we do have one part which is ZCML. There's actually, ZCML has built-in support for knowing what kind of strings you have to translate in those. We simply do not use it at this time. None of the parts that we define somewhere in ZCML, there was, for example, browser menus which have a title. We just don't use any part right now in Plone where the ZCML translation would be relevant for us at any point. So there's a tool which I will show it later on, i18n dude, which we use usually for extracting messages. It just doesn't support extracting of anything that is defined in ZCML right now, because we just simply don't use it in Plone as a default. There's other tools which do extract those information, but for us, there's currently no reason.
And still no?
I still don't know any single case where something that is defined in the ZCML actually would show up. It might be that an extension profile, the title of an extension profile, might show up at a certain point, but I think it still doesn't. So there's a couple of strings which actually the machinery knows. There's built-in support for even marking those with message IDs in a certain structured way. But as to my knowledge, there is just no case where we actually use it. So I wrote a very simple Python package, tutorial.i18n. It's just based on standard paster zobscale. I just wrote, create me a zobs3 project, paster create -t, clone 3 project. Then I used a couple of those local commands. I'm not going to show this. This is if you are interested in this, talk to someone else or just. I can't cover this in this talk as well. So there's a couple of commands where you just have the bootstrapping code of how to actually generate a package. There's even a command where you can say, oh, I want to define an archetypes-based content type. Yes, this is a name. And then there's even a command where you can say, well, I want to add a couple of fields to it. And we'll just take care of like all the bits you need to do with, oh yes, I need to register my type in, it needs to be, has a workflow assignment, it needs to be in the portal factory, it needs to be in the types XML, it will just take care of that. There's other approaches where you can bootstrap Arch and XML. There's another approach where you can bootstrap a package, you can just write it on your own. I was just lazy and used this approach. The code of this whole package is very, very tiny. It just defines basically one content type that is called book. I couldn't think of any more boring example. And it's just basically one content type with a couple of fields, and then there's going to be one template, one kind of listing template, which I'm going to show. So far for the first amounts of slides. What we can do now is just to actually look at something more interesting, which is going to be code. So this is the typical header of if you are really into it and really want to do it the right way and define all your namespaces and define whatever. This is a typical header of a page template. What is most interesting for us is there is a namespace called i18n. I assume you will have some kind of knowledge about page templates, tar and metal. I'm not going to cover that. So there is, besides tar and metal, there's a third namespace which is called i18n, which is going to have some comments available for us. The first thing we define up here is that i18n domain. Just as a question, can you read that, or should I make that? Should I increase the font size? That's fine.
Increase font size.
Is that better or even more?
That's good.
Okay. Good. The first thing we need to define is that domain which we are going to use. Clone itself uses a couple of domains for all of its parts. What you should do as a best practice is just to say, for my particular package, I'm going to define my own domain, and all of the templates I write, are just going to use that particular domain. So I don't have to care about something where I put it into the clone domain, I just translated all of it. I figured out what part of clone actually I copied over something like a cancel button from default clone. If I copy that over, it has and put it on the domain clone, maybe we'll change in clone how a cancel button looks like. We'll just get rid of the name, and suddenly you have one message more, which you supposed was in the clone domain, but actually is not anymore. If you don't want to actually always have a look about synchronizing, okay, what kind of messages are used in clone, and synchronize that or diff that in any way to what you do, the simplest approach is just to say, well, I'm going to use my own domain. There's going to be one exception later on where we actually have to use a clone domain, but as a general rule, if you just use your own domain, and the very simple practice is just to name it in the same way your package is named, as a general convention, then you are most of the time just fine. So the first very, very basic one is there is something called i18n translate. Usually this will render as an H1 tag, which has published book. Not very fancy. There's two ways of telling something it should be translated. The first one is you don't specify anything here. That means the TAL machinery and i18n machinery will take the actual text you put into this part and will use published book as actually the message that is going to be shown, that's actually tracked in all the message catalogs, that is actually what the translator is going to see. The other approach means you put in one of those message IDs to make sure if you use published books at any other point in a different context, it might be that the heading requires a different kind of capitalization, that in one language you have always lowercase or always uppercase, or like camel case, you might at some points, but at some points you are not. So there might be a good reason why you want to have a bit of a understanding of what is this about and in what exact context this is going to be used. There's a couple of reasons why in most of clone we use actually explicit message IDs. There's a couple of reasons that has to do with, okay, it should be a unique value and you should be able to identify where exactly in what context it's going to be used. For a long time we also did it because the translation tools we have, what happens if you say you change this in any way, in any minor way, and just say something like this. For the most part of how we used clone, this would result in the translator losing all of its translation of published books and getting a new translation that is called published books with an exclamation mark. So far, what we did to our translators was always, okay, you lose your work, and here's a new one. If you have a heading, if you have a message ID defined, what he's going to see is actually, here is still the same message, but it's marked as fuzzy, which means there has been a change. You should look if your translation is still actually exactly what is in the original message. It's kind of, that basically later on, I can probably just cover that later on. That's a bit about how translators will actually see those things. Yeah, please.
What if you've done it wrong and you haven't specified an ID for it, and you
Yeah.
want to go and change it? go back and specify the original text as the ID?
You could, but that basically means you will end up 3 years later on, if you do that every single time, the translator is going to see something like published books, which should be shown like published books with an exclamation mark and 3 sentences to it. And if that is for every single message, you are going to have a bit of trouble to finding out what happened here and why is my message ID always completely different from what the actual text is. As a general rule, if your message changes only slightly, it is okay to keep the ID. If you really write something differently, use a different ID. So you could also change this to see and write something like exclamation to it if that is really what you want. But in general, what you always could do is be nice to your translators. As developers, we know what subversion is about and what version control is about, how to diff the former state to the last state, and we can actually be nice and just say, okay, we are going to preserve this and mark this in some way that, well, please have a look at it. For some reason, there's kind of I wouldn't say two classes of translators, but there's a couple of translators which usually work basically on text, which usually have like huge documents which they're going to translate. There's a couple of commercial software around that, Trados, WordFast, which all have one feature which is called translation memory. What they are about is, I translate a document, there's a new revision of that whole document coming in. I want to make sure that I have some way that my tool gives me, okay, this is actually exactly the same, and here are the 3 paragraphs, and it automatically remembers in a memory what was the last state of it, and will show me that as an example and provide me that information. Most user interface translators I've seen so far do not use any tools with that feature. There's a couple of tools, even free ones like PO Edit, which actually do have such a feature, but I've never seen a single translator who actually uses it. If they would use it, the tool itself would give them the hint of, here's something that looks very familiar, does a fuzzy matching of, here's something that looks very familiar, do you want to use a translation? For some reason, at least none of the user interface translators we have in the Plone community seem to use any of those tools. They are a bit more difficult. If you work as a professional translator, you want to use those, because then you can say you translated a document of 150 pages, it takes you just 1 hour to translate it the second time for the next revision. This is what you make your money off. All the translators who work on open source communities seem to have either too much time or do not use it so often that they do not use those tools. Okay. So that's like the most basic example. The next example is something where we have something like i18 attributes. If you know what TAL attributes is about, which is up front here, TAL attribute defines there should be something like the source string, and it should actually be replaced by whatever is noted in here. So in the actual outcome of the rendering, there's not going to be image source is just my anchor tag, but there's going to be something put into it. i18n attributes works kind of similar, that it says, well, the alt tag here should actually be under the message ID title books, should actually be, yes, this is one part of the template that is actually going to be internationalized, and this is some part which we actually do want to care about. And then it just says, well, with the title, it's going to be the same. What I did here is just to say, well, the message ID for both of those is the same. I could specify one of them as title books and the other one is alt books. It's very, I haven't really seen anyone who actually makes a difference between the alt tag and what is noted in it and the title tag, even though there is a semantic difference, but I've just never seen someone who actually do that. So in those cases, it's most of the time fine to say, well, this is going to be the same string, it does have the same semantic meaning, we are going to use the same message ID. The other way of doing it is, again, this is with a message ID provided. The other way of doing it would just be to say, well, I shouldn't be as fast. Just not specify anything here. What you need to take care of is this needs a semicolon if you don't do this, because otherwise, what is this? Is this the alt tag with a message ID of title, or is this the alt and the title, which both should be translated? This would mean the alt attribute should be recognized as something that needs to be translated with the message ID of title. So just as a good practice, it's worthwhile to just always mark with a semicolon and just at the end as well. So you will never, if you come in later on and specify something in here, you will never forget that one semicolon at the end and just make sure, like, okay, why is this not working? Well, because there was a missing semicolon. This is actually one of the cases. We do not have many semicolons in Python, but this is actually one of the cases where we do have to think about them. Another case, this one is probably a bit hard to understand of its own if you've never seen that. The basic idea of this one, an i18n name, is going to be, well, what is actually going to be shown to the user? This is something where the content is dynamic, and this is going to be shown as something like, we found 0 books, we found 1 book, we found 2 books, we found 3 books. One approach is to say, well, dear translator, you have to translate all of those sentences up to the number 9,999. He's not going to like that, and not very efficient. So if you have any dynamic part inside a message, there is a syntax to say, well, this is actually the dynamic part, which we usually say it's a variable. You can actually put a variable in your message to say, well, the only thing the translator needs to translate is we found, then has a syntax to specify, here comes the variable, books, and is finished. One problem with that is what we do not have in any way right now is we do not have what is called plural form supports. What this is going to show is we found 0 books, we found 1 books. Not quite what you want, but there's no really decent way of specifying this in any way. The programmer way of doing it, the American programmer way of doing it would be, let's put a tal condition up front. If it's one message, we write out, we found 1 book. In all the other cases, we write out, we found many books. The problem is different languages have different plural forms, and there's even languages which have up to 5 to 7 plural forms, depending on something like, if the number is divisible by 10, then it's a different kind of plural form than if it's divisible by whatever. There is languages, like, I have no idea who came up with that idea. It's just a matter of evolution that we actually have languages which have more than 1 plural form. They actually have many, and the rules for them are just arbitrary. There can be any rule, basically. So what we have right now is just we ignore that fact and just have no support for it. There's ongoing support by Leonard Riegerbro to actually put it into our tool set and make this actually available. The getText standard has a solution for that, where you can actually say, well, this is still 1 message, and here is, depending on how many translations from you have, different amounts of translations for it. And a lot of languages just have the case where 1 is treated differently than all the rest of it. Other languages have different matters for that. We basically are stuck with a way of try either to avoid these kinds of sentences, or live with the fact that there's going to be a special case where it's not going to be correct. The amount of work you need to put in to provide the correct solution is so much more that it's just one of those cases where you need to be, okay, do we really want to be correct and spend another 100 hours of development time on this? Nah, probably not. Just we are just being realistic at that point. Okay. This is probably another example. So basically, that's the 3 ways of doing this. Like, there is i18n translator, i18n attributes, and i18n name. You can combine those in very complex structures, where you can have, for example, the title tag of an image can be something which includes a dynamic part. You can do that. The question is, do you really want to? Yeah?
Is the reason why it doesn't translate because we're using i18n name? Or is it just because it's a nested tag?
No, this is actually, if I wouldn't specify i18n name, what the translator would see is a whole source code of the span tag inside this message. Translators usually do not know anything about HTML, programming languages, or further on, and there's a good reason to keep that separation, so you are the ones that actually have to think a bit more to make it the translators a lot easier. If you have multiple languages, you have, for example, in Plone, we have about 50 different languages. If each of those people would need to know a lot more, well, it's more efficient if the person who actually puts in the change knows a bit more, and then 50 other people do not have to know anything about HTML and so on. Yeah, please.
Just out of curiosity, what kind of string would the translator see for that example?
Basically, if I do this, what he's going to see is exactly this.
He'll see all the span and everything?
He's going to see all the span, all the tal omit tag.
Well, but if we do it right, what does he see?
Okay.
The 7 or the word count?
Nope, we can just have a look at that and say tutorial. Just find this one. This is actually this is the English this is the German translation. So the original one is this one. This is what the translator sees. So if you've ever seen any kind of substitution syntax, this is actually the one thing you need to tell the translators, and actually the one thing that is a bit different depending on the open source project you work for, what exact way of denoting that variable part you have. One of the things we need to tell the H translator all the time, especially if you hire for your project an external translator who hasn't done any work on Plone so far, you will always have to make sure you tell him about this syntax, because otherwise what he's going to do is he's going to do this. Because there is no way of him knowing that these kind of fancy curly brackets have any special meaning to them. If you do this, the result what the end user is going to see is exactly this string without the variable part being substituted. Because the programming language doesn't know anything about how to retranslate Anzahl into count again. What it's going to do is just see, I have a couple of names here, and one of them is count. Is that string actually inside the original one in those curly brackets? Yes, then replace the part. If it's not, well, do nothing about it.
Write a tool that does that.
Well, what you need to do is there's a couple of things.
Ignore my comment, please.
No, but actually, one of the things we have in Plone one test case, which actually, the only thing it does is to compare if all the curly brackets variable names in the original translation are actually inside the target translation. And we constantly find whenever, like every month, there's going to be 1 or 2 of those cases where somebody omitted it or did just simple things, just wrote it, for example, this way. Because he doesn't really know about how significant the exact syntax is. Language is strict in some parts, but it's a lot more forgiving in other parts. So if you have a space between the end of the sentence and the comma, there is no, it's still something you can read. A programming language needs exactly this one syntax, and if you do not do anything about it, well, it's going to be a syntax error, and it doesn't know what to do with it. So this is just, this is like the part where it's complicated. One other part you should try to avoid is to have too many of those variables in one message. One of the parts is like, if the sentence would not be we found count books, but something like we found count books out of count 2. Like we found 0 books out of 13. Is a perfectly fine message and something you might show, like here's the search results, and out of the available messages so many matched your result. If you do that, you can't forget about anything like plural form support, because what you end up with is the actual translation might depend on both numbers, and then you end up with a matrix. Because it might depend on both of them, and if the one is divisible by 10, but the other one is divisible by 5, then you have a different case than all the others. There's just no support in any of getText or any of the tools, because it's just too complicated. So try to, anything that is numeric in its nature, try to avoid. You can do it as a programmer, but you cannot handle it as a translation machine and try to avoid multiple numbers in the same message. Try just to write those as 2 different messages. Yeah?
Create these after you're done with your template. You immediately go and build this. What's your process?
That's the second step. That's what I'm going to cover in like how this is generated by i18n, how to actually do that. So basically I wanted to just, the first part is just to show like what do I actually need to do to all my source code, and then once I did that, here's a tool I need to run after I did it. I can use that tool repeatedly during the process to make sure after any change I made, actually is this the result, is this showing up the way I wanted, especially with those variables names, is this actually showing up, or is it still showing me something which I don't want the translator to see. So there is good reasons to sometimes just make an iterative process out of it and make sure after every change you did that. Probably something like, you will find those very easily. Just like something you can always do is just search for one of those tags, or just the greater equals or lower equals sign. Usually you'll not find those in anywhere in your messages. You would usually write those out. So if you have one of those, you probably have to review it. So just internationalizing one template or a couple of those, and then do a bit of review is probably fine. The rest of my template is basically pretty dumb. One thing which goes into the next section is a bit about date formatting. But before I touch that, like that was a very short version of like what you can do in child templates and how to internationalize those. Are there any more questions about those or are you all a bit familiar with it and struggled with all the problems already, so you kind of know the basic syntax, or should I explain more about that? I just see.
We're good. We're good.
Yep. Okay. Okay. This is basically because it's still in the template. The next part is going to be a bit about what to do on the Python code level, what you need to take care of here. And this is one part of like writing Python statements in your templates. Discouraged. You should not do that, kind of. You have a browser view. Actually, this does have a browser view as its backend, so I could really do it in the backend. But this is one of the most common cases where we actually write it in the template. The difference here is, depending on what language you are actually using to view a site, the format of the date changes. Because American data notation is just different from any other one, and every every single country basically has its own date formatting rules. When the date, if the year comes first, if you use a slash as a separator, if you use a point, if you write out, usually you write out 4 digits for the year or just 2 of them, if you have some spaces in between, all of these are going to be different. Yeah?
So this would not work if you put it in the browser view, or is it?
It would work if I put it in the browser view. I just would have to write a bit differently. This is a case where this is a Python script. Yes, I know. There's a method available on the clone view which does exactly the same. Actually, this Python script, all it does is to call that view. I could write it into my browser view, call the clone view, get multi-adapter, whatever, and then use it. For this particular one use case, I think it's perfectly just fine to write that in your template. Especially if you have just some catalog results and iterate over them, and one of them is going to be a date. Just for that single purpose, writing it into your browser view and doing it might be a bit overhead. So that's one I think we deprecated this Python script at one point in one of the releases, but figured out there's really no point. There's like the mantra of everything you should not have Python code in your templates, but there's a certain point where you just need to say, well, okay, this really doesn't hurt. This is one very simple use case. It's fine. Don't overcomplicate this one simple use case. So what this actually does is you have up front here something like books. This is defined. This is actually a list of dictionaries which comes from the browser view. Book is just one entry and a dictionary, and there's going to be a date of some kind in here. And all I do is I say to localize time. The date would always be in the internal date representation. It's going to be stored in the database. All I do is just to say to localize time. There is one switch to it, which says, do I want a short format or do I want to have a long format? The difference is, do I only want to show the date or do I want to include the time of it? So that script just has one parameter where I can specify that. But this is the most simple way of, okay, this is just fine to do. If whenever I have a date, I need to make sure, well, I actually do show it in the localized time. The OP3 has a lot more support for different kind of like the date formatting machinery we have in Plone. It's kind of awkward. The way it is built is kind of, we do use the translation machinery in the backend to provide those. There is international projects, well, ICU is one of them, which do actually have a whole set of rules about what is the most common date format, and not just one date format, but what is a very short one, a middle version, a longer version. There's lots more about this date formatting, and which touches currency formatting in some way, number formatting. How do if I write out 1,000, I do that differently in different languages. Sometimes I have a dot as a separator, sometimes I have a comma. We do not have any good support, any good documented support in that in Plone right now. There's ways of doing it and actually accessing the OP3 machinery, but it's something that is not fairly simple to explain. I think Philipp von Weitershausen might have touched that in his book about web component development to a certain degree. But it's usually something where you need to really have a look, and you usually need to write a bit of Python code to do something. So I just don't touch it. Basically, we don't use it in Plone itself. There's good reasons why you should do that at times, but we just don't cover it. So this is just the very basic version of short date, long date. Okay, that's it. Okay. Then we actually do have a bit more here. The next thing we can look at is an actual content type. I'm just going to use this one first. This is something you might have seen as well. This is a schema of an archetypes-based content type. It does have at some point a widget definition to it. And the widget is something that is actually shown to the user So we should, in some way, translate it. The trick here is we cannot translate it at the point where we define this. The problem is we do not know in what language we should translate it in. So what we do here is, in a very interesting way, to mark up something as this provides a bit more information. This is not just a string, but this is actually a string with a bit more information attached to it. So once we come to the step where it's actually going to be rendered, we do not only have the information, well, this is just the string translated without any domain, without any possibility to define a message identifier, without any possibility to have those variable name support in it, but we just mark it up as this is actually going to be a string that needs to have a bit of more information. The underscore seems a bit weird most of the times. Why do we use an underscore? Like, why do we not use something like translate, if I would get that right? Whatever this is a function that returns me something in the end, and it has an argument of author. I just tend to write it always with Unicode here. Obviously, it doesn't matter in this case because it's just ASCII. But the whole point of using this underscore is just a convention, and it's a getText convention that says we have an extraction tool which runs over our Python code, and all it does is to look for these underscore functions. It doesn't run the actual code. What the tool actually does is to parse the Python code in the same way Python would do it, build an abstract syntax tree of it, and iterate over it. And all it does is just to look for those functions. And the only way it knows what to look for is by that convention of saying, this is an underscore. getText does that. That's just a getText convention. You can use C code where you use exactly the same pattern. You can use it in Python code. You can use it even in PHP code. It's just a convention that says, well, this is an underscore. And this is what provides the information to the extraction tool. The machinery who translates it would not need to know about it, but the extraction mechanism of, I want to know all the strings in my project or my package which needs translation, is actually the place, okay, this needs this underscore. Yeah?
You imported the message factory as underscore?
Right. That's obviously like, how does that thing come into place?
If you would change the underscore here, would it break it, or would the i18n machinery work differently and not look for the underscore anymore?
I can do, for example, this, and
Do you want to take a break in your lecture while I change the tape?
okay, we'll just take a short break. I think we are still quite good on time, so we'll just make sure we'll take like 7 minutes. Not 10, because 10 is always going to be 15, so we'll just say 7 and it's going to be 10, okay?